Mass raids to deport immigrants in the U.S. are set to take place this weekend. A commission from the UN Security Council is in Colombia to evaluate the implementation of the peace agreements. And Sudan's ruling military council says an attempted coup has been thwarted. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South. I am Doris Polo. We start in the U.S., where the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency has announced they will carry out mass raids to deport migrants over the weekend. Our correspondent in Washington, D.C., Jorge Gestoso, brings us the details.
Thank you. According to the New York Times, this weekend are going to start the massive deportations of migrants. It's speculated that could be about thousands of them that have already received papers of deportation and didn't leave the country. It's speculated that could be taking place in among 10 cities in the country, and they don't know exactly where they're going to place them. And the speculation is that could be in hotels that could take between at least 10 and more days to make them leave the country. And the president of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, has already warned everybody that if the representative of ICE show up to the different homes in order to request that people to leave, they need to present at least 2 types of documents, papers, and if not, they are not supposed to open the door. We get back to you now.
That was Jorge Gestoso with that report. Now, one of the most dire consequences of anti-migrant policies spreading across the U.S. is the inhumane treatment of minors in detention centers. Our correspondent in the U.S., Alina Duarte, brings us more on this desperate situation.
While desperately seeking out a better life for her and her daughter in the U.S., Yasmin Juarez confronted perhaps the harshest irony, the death of her 21-month-old daughter. The grieving mother says it was the deplorable conditions and the lack of proper medical services at the migrant detention center that contributed to her child's death.
You have no idea how hard it has been for me to go on without my daughter. They took a piece of my heart away. They tore my soul apart.
The Border Patrol officers also dished out abuse and threats. She says they kept asking her why she was seeking asylum in the U.S. as though she had no right to do so.
He said to me, you know, this is an American country and our president is Donald Trump, and we can take your daughter away and put you in jail. I was speechless, and all I could do was cry.
Heart-wrenching accounts such as this one are very common in the U.S. It was recently reported that minors detained at the newly opened detention center in Yuma, Arizona, suffered sexual abuse.
Who alleges she was sexually assaulted by a Border Patrol agent.
In addition to the unhygienic, overcrowded conditions in these detention centers, a report has revealed that a U.S. custody agent touched the breasts and genitals of a 15-year-old girl while other agents laughed as they watched. Meanwhile, a Honduran child was severely mocked and bullied. Many U.S. lawmakers who toured these detention centers have publicly condemned these atrocities.
We don't need new laws. We need morality. We need an administration that understands there are human rights violations happening.
While human rights organizations, activists, and a sizable segment of the U.S. population have demanded the shutdown of these detention centers, the Immigration and Customs Services keeps opening new facilities along the border.
Washington, D.C. Following 3 days of talks in Barbados, Norway's Minister of Foreign Affairs has announced that Venezuela's government and opposition are continuing negotiations which were initiated in Oslo. A communiqué released on Thursday says that, quote, as part of this process, a negotiation table has been established that will work in a continuous and efficient manner to reach an agreed upon solution within the framework of the Constitution, end quote. The statement also urged both parties to use caution when making comments about the process and thanked the government of Barbados for its hospitality. And President Nicolas Maduro had this to say about the latest phase of the talks, which took place this week in Barbados.
We can't say everything, but we must say something regarding the permanent dialogue table, because we have made commitments with the government of Norway, with the Venezuelan opposition, to take with prudence all of the issues which we hold conversations over and take care of this permanent dialogue table, which exists and which is active, functioning with the Venezuelan opposition, promoted by the desire for peace. You all know that as of months ago, I spoke with many parties from around the world. I had very good conversations with the government of Norway, of which we know very well as together we participated, Norway and Venezuela, in the process of peace between the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, and the government of Colombia. We were together for 4 years, and we know them well. And they proposed to me a number of initiatives, of meetings, of encounters, of dialogue with the Venezuelan opposition. And I said, great, I'm in total agreement. Let's do it. I believe in dialogue. I believe in my word. I believe in peace. I believe in the diplomacy of peace.
Our correspondent in Caracas, Adriana Sivori, brings us the latest.
This new round at the negotiation table culminated on Wednesday between the government and the Venezuelan opposition. That is what was announced by the Minister of Communication through social media. I'll read precisely what it is he said. This day of the permanent dialogue table for peace ends in Barbados, a space for settling disputes through constitutional and peaceful means, successful exchange sponsored by the government of Norway. We thank the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, for her hospitality. There were 3 days of closed-door negotiations, as have been the negotiations between the government and the opposition. The issues which had been announced for the first time back in May in Oslo, which is when the round of conversations began, include economic issues, the political issues, and also the electoral issue. It's been interesting with regards to the electoral issue. The government had always announced through the course of these weeks that there would be another round of negotiations, that there would be news from these conversations in order to reach stability in Venezuela. All the while, the opposition had denied these conversations and didn't say anything in regards to this issue, and at last they sat down on Monday once again. And the issues, like I mentioned, were primarily the political, the economic, and the electoral issues. There was something very interesting that happened on social media and in the daily news publications. For example, they spoke about how among the issues debated was whether or not there would be a general election by year's end, and speculation about an election the coming year, and a number of rumors spurring over what is being discussed at the dialogue table, all of which remains purely speculative.
Shifting gears now, in Brazil, the lower house of Congress has voted in favor of pension reform despite months of protests against the proposal. The House voted 379 for and 131 against in this first reading of President Jair Bolsonaro's key pension bill. The House will now debate amendments before a second vote. If approved then, it will move to the Senate after the congressional recess. The government says the reform is meant to save billions from the federal budget, but the opposition says it is a brutal attack on basic rights. There were various protests against the pension reform before and after the vote. Thousands marched through the center of Sao Paulo, threatening to bring Brazil to a standstill if the bill is finally passed into law. And in Brasilia, protesters tried to break into the Congress before they were driven back by the police with tear gas and pepper spray.
Today is a very difficult day because we see that the majority in Congress wants to vote in favor. Our bench, the opposition, is very small, but the people are on the streets, and when it comes to rights, a lot is won from the street, from popular pressure and mobilization.
The working class is living in misery. Heads of families are living on the street because they can't pay the rent. It's tough. So before they mess with the pockets of the poor, they have to reach inside their own pockets, because there are many people there in Congress retiring at 40, 50 years, and we have to die to retire.
Earlier, I spoke with Brazilian journalist Breno Altman to talk about the pension reform and what is next in the fight against it.
But we have to understand that there is a very strong mediatic battle in favor of this pension reform. We are talking the battle for this pension reform unified the ruling classes in Brazil, the mainly media systems, and the government and the deputies. I mean, the side in favor of pension reform is very strong. But I think that we are going towards, in the next days and weeks, a stronger social mobilization in the streets against pension reform. This reform is supposed to be voted in order to be approved. Is supposed to be voted for a second time at the lower house, and at first and second times at the Senate. I mean, the social movement, the unions still have time to fight against pension reform in the next couple of weeks before it's eventually being approved by the parliament.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Nation Security Council is visiting Colombia to evaluate the implementation of the peace process with the FARC. One of its main concerns will be the wave of murders of former guerrillas as well as community leaders. Our correspondent Tatiana Portela has more from Bogota.
The visit will be until the 14th of this month, and the aim of this commission from the UN Security Council is to see how the implementation of the peace agreements is going. They'll be meeting with both the government and the FARC political party, as well as with representatives of civil society organizations who've played a key part in the implementation of the accord. On Friday, the members of the commission will have a private meeting with President Ivan Duque, and then they and the president are scheduled to hold a news conference at the Foreign Ministry. And after that, they will have their meetings with the FARC and civil society. On Saturday, they are due to travel to a reincorporation zone where former guerrillas have been since the implementation of the peace agreement began. We don't know yet exactly which of those zones they will visit, but we have been told that the media will not be allowed access. So this first visit by the Security Council delegates to a reincorporation zone will be quite a secretive affair. The commission will be returning to New York on Sunday morning, and there they will draw up the conclusions of their visit on the state of the peace process. But the Security Council has made it clear that the issue of the reincorporation of former guerrillas will be a central concern. They want to evaluate how much the government has done to achieve this. And they say one of their greatest concerns will be the wave of murders of former combatants and community leaders.
That was Tatiana Portela with that report. Now we move to the Caribbean, where the former FIFA Vice President Jack Warner has been ordered to pay a $79 million penalty stemming from the Football Association bribery scandal. A U.S. federal judge imposed the judgment against Warner, a Trinidad and Tobago national, in a 2017 lawsuit brought by the Confederation of North, Central America and Caribbean Association Football. Warner is accused of embezzling millions of dollars from the CONCACAF. He is also accused of other corruption offenses. Warner has denied any wrongdoing as he continues to fight extradition in his homeland, where he remains on bail. And following the U.S. federal court ruling, plaintiff lawyer John Custer has said that the football organization, quotes, intends to pursue all available avenues to enforce the judgment in any jurisdiction where CONCACAF has reason to believe Mr. Warner may have assets, end quote. And it's a no deal. Late negotiations between Barbados and Antigua and Barbuda have collapsed. The discussions, which took place earlier this week in Antigua, reportedly lasted only a few hours before breaking down. Reports state that one of the sticking points to Barbados selling its 49.4% majority stake in the regional airline was Prime Minister Mia Mottley's insistence that Antigua and Barbuda would have to take up Barbados's almost $100 million loan commitments. That debt is due mainly to a loan from the Caribbean Development Bank, which was used to purchase 3 Leat aircrafts. Leat needs $5.4 million in emergency funding to keep the airline in the sky. Sudan's ruling military council has reportedly foiled an attempted coup, arresting at least 12 officers. According to the head of the Transitional Military Council, the OCUP hoped to undermine an agreement between the military and the opposition. The thwarted coup involved a number of retired officers, as well as officers still in service. The military and civilian representatives agreed last week on a joint sovereign council that will rule for 3 years while elections are organized. Nigerian army officers will face court-martial over alleged sabotage in the fight against armed group Boko Haram. The exact charges have not been specified, but over the past 2 years, some army officers have long been suspected of colluding with Boko Haram.
For those who are familiar with the military system of justice, after the court makes its own judgment, it is being confirmed by Army Council. Once the Army Council confirms that, yet the person is free to appeal, because it is assumed that this court has the same status of the High Court, for those who are familiar with military justice.
Still in Nigeria, police have fired live ammunition and tear gas during protests staged by members of the Islamic movement. Eyewitnesses say while it did not appear the police were aiming at protesters, officers were firing live rounds. Protesters are demanding the release of their jailed leader, Ibrahim Zakzaki, who they say needs urgent medical attention. Zakzaki has been in custody since 2015 for allegedly attempting to kill the army chief. On Tuesday, Nigeria's National Assembly went into lockdown after gunshots erupted during a violent confrontation between the sides. In South Africa, the Friends of Cuba Society held protests in front of Parliament, calling for an end to the U.S. economic blockade against Cuba. We have more in this report.
Hands off Cuba! Hands off! Hands off! Hands off Cuba! Hands off! Hands off!
Most of the protesters were not even born when Cubans shed their blood on African soil for the freedom South Africans enjoy today.
The Cubans have continued to show practical solidarity, where today, for example, there are more than 2,000 young South Africans who are studying medicine in Cuba. But the Cubans have also sent people in the areas of engineering and housing and many other areas to our country to help us build a just and equitable society.
Among those protesting are members of the South African Communist Party, the Young Communist League and Friends of Cuba Society. Protesters expressed disgust with the tightening of U.S. sanctions against Cuba.
President Trump has decided to enact Article 3 of the Helms-Burton Act, which allows American citizens to lay claim against properties that has been nationalized by the Cuban Revolution. The impact of that in terms of the economy and the livelihood of the Cubans are immense.
This month is a month of the Cubans when they get their revolution. It was July. So what we are showing now, we are showing the support of them, that since they are celebrating on the 26th of July, we are showing that we are with them all the years, because they were also with us before. They are still with us today.
The Friends of Cuba Society are planning a number of protests this month, also as a celebration of the Cuban Revolution 60 years ago. Johanna Abrams for Telesur in Cape Town.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. Russia's foreign ministry has said that British media outlets should be ready to face the consequences of their government's actions. This comes after Russian news agencies RT and Sputnik were denied accreditation by the UK government for the Global Conference for Media Freedom in London, accusing them of spreading disinformation. Despite several attempts from the outlets and strong condemnation from the Russian government, the journalists were never allowed to attend the event, which came to a close on Thursday.
I said again that it's absurd. If you claim a media outlet to spread fake news, you should provide proof. Until you do this, it all means nothing. It's nonsense. To conclude, I'll point out that we are always guided by the principle of reciprocity. In this regard, British mass media that works in Russia should be ready to face the consequences of the British government's actions.
The Bolivian president, Evo Morales, is in Russia, where he has signed a number of cooperation agreements. Morales arrived in Moscow in the morning and headed straight into talks with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The two leaders then spoke about their agreements, which cover electric and nuclear power, agriculture, the lithium industry, and security. Putin thanked the Bolivian leader for helping to build a multilateral political system that supports international law and defends democracy and the sovereign rights of each state.
We just signed a joint declaration that underlined the very important and strategic character of the relationship between Russia and Bolivia. We expressed our strong political commitment to Bolivia's development. We placed special emphasis on economic relations, and we've agreed to expand the volume of investment and trade.
For Bolivia and Latin America, Russia is hugely important in the international context over a lot of political issues. It is important that Russia leads the defense of international law. There can be unilateral positions, there can be impositions and interventions. A few governments are fighting for sovereignty and independence of our states.
Now we move to Uruguay, where July is a month of celebration for the country's African diaspora. Throughout the month, Afro-Uruguayan citizens celebrate their history, their achievements, and come together so their voices can be heard.
Candombe is perhaps the most important expression of Afro-Uruguayan culture, but it's hardly the only one. For the fourth year running, the Uruguayan government has declared July as the month of the African diaspora, in the hopes of promoting policies that improve matters of social inclusion, healthcare, and housing for Afro-Uruguayans.
This is a month promoted by public institutions, but it would be good to see private companies and various social sectors use this month to analyze and help improve the situation of Afro-Uruguayans.
This month will see many events centered on the lives of Afro-Uruguayan women. One of the most important events will be the launch of the Marielle Fund, named after the Afro-Brazilian human rights activist Marielle Franco. It seeks to link together many different social struggles.
The Marielle Fund hopes to link together different social struggles against racism, homophobia, and xenophobia. We hope to see various social organizations come together to present projects that would, in some way, unite the fight against these various issues.
Afro-Uruguayans make up 8% of the country's population, and within the community there are often higher rates of poverty, unemployment, and lack of access to education than the wider population. Despite recent advances in these areas, things have not improved sufficiently for Afro-Uruguayans.
Living conditions nowadays have a double edge. On one side, there's been progress in relation to the past, because the poverty and unemployment rates were much higher. Nonetheless, inequality is still an issue and work needs to be done to improve the living conditions of Afro-Uruguayans.
The choice of July as the month of the African diaspora has a deeper significance. As on July 18th, Nelson Mandela International Day is already celebrated, and July 25th is the International Day of the Afro-Latin American and Caribbean woman.
And now for sports. England have qualified for their first Cricket World Cup final in 27 years with an 8-wicket demolition of Australia at Edgbaston in the United Kingdom. Facing New Zealand in the finals on Sunday, England bowled their rivals Australia away with a 226-for-2 win against a 223 all-out. Aaron Finch's decision to bat appeared to backfire, with Chris Wokes and Jofra Archer batting away the Australian top order. Man of the match Chris Wokes took 3 for 20, outing David Warner, Australia's leading scorer in the tournament, for 9. It's the first time defending champions Australia have been bundled out in the semi-final stage, having won the title 5 times. That brings us to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Doris Polo. Thank you for watching.